So, current landscape. We're talking a little bit about what we're seeing in the cybersecurity world related to cyber insurance. We're going to talk about improving your insurance through a couple of different technologies that we are seeing being most consistently asked in most cybersecurity insurance questionnaires and application processes, and what you can do about that to improve your posture and ensure that you're going to get the best coverage you possibly can get. We're going to talk about hardware and software patching a little bit, best practice for your backups, information security governance, security training, and security information and event management. So let's talk about the current landscape. We are seeing an incredible rise in the cybersecurity loss ratio from pre-pandemic to during and post-pandemic. As COVID took place, cyber attacks increased dramatically. The largest increase we've seen year over year in the history of cybersecurity. And we are seeing that is causing a direct effect on the premiums. So as the rate of loss ratio, the payouts, got into the 70% range, we saw the premiums rose significantly for everyone to pay for that cybersecurity insurance, because, for lack of a better way of putting it, the cybersecurity insurers were taking a hard hit because of the amount of claims, because of the amount of attacks. And just to put a scope on the size of cybercrime and what it really is and what it really means. People think of cybercrime maybe still as something, some people do sometimes, or some people spend some time on here and there, or, script kiddies, or, the movie Hackers, or things like that we saw. And that's not what cybercrime is today. It is large scale corporate crime. It is a massive industry, and it's expected that by 2025, it'll be a $10.5 trillion industry. That makes it one of the largest single industries in the world. It puts it ahead of food production worldwide. It puts it ahead of manufacturing worldwide. It puts it ahead of oil and gas worldwide. The only thing that is larger is pretty much financial services. So that's how large an industry and how large a potential the criminals see of a reason to get into this business. And the worst part is, what we don't realize and what we don't see in the Western world so much, and in North America, is that in a lot of countries where cybercrime activity is rampant, the people that are doing the cybercrime don't necessarily even realize what they're doing is a crime in other countries. They're just going to work every day and doing what their employer has laid out for them to do, and that is contributing to that cybercrime activity. So what can you do to make sure that you tick all the right boxes and put yourself in the best position so that when you go to apply or renew for your cybersecurity insurance, you're going to get the best possible rate and put yourself in the best possible position? So one of the first things we talked about was multi-factor authentication. So the types of questions you're going to see from multi-factor authentication is, are you using multi-factor authentication for all your cloud services and email accounts? Are you using multi-factor authentication for remote desktop or virtual private? So if your information is being accessed remotely, are you using multi-factor authentication to ensure that the people that are logging into your environment are actually your people and not someone who's acting as one of your people because they got a hold of your credentials? And multi-factor authentication is really the only way to do that, whether it be on your phone with a 6-digit code, whether it be an app you put on your phone, whether you go to the old school tokens, because that's what fits for some of your users, or telephone verification. Having some sort of secondary verification of who your users are is really important. And to highlight just how important that is, we've seen something out from the insurance providers very recently, where due to one of the carrier coalition's underwriting, they have now said that if you're 25 million in revenue or less, If you don't have MFA in place, they're going to put a funds transfer loss endorsement on your plan. And if you don't have MFA in place, you're either going to see a price increase or you may not be able to get coverage. So John, can you just kind of talk about why MFA is so important?
You bet. So Tyson covered about, the methods of using multi-factor and common areas that the providers are looking for you to place it. MFA is not 100% guaranteed, but at the same time, according to Microsoft, it's going to prevent 98% of identity attacks. So that's a really good start. In addition to that, new questionnaires are asking for MFA in more places. So we want MFA on anything to do with remote access, MFA on your VPN clients, virtual private network. In addition to that, now we are seeing the ask for MFA on your networking equipment. So if you're going to change your firewall or administer a network device, that must be behind multi-factor. Your login to a Windows server, so a local server login, they're also looking for multi-factor there. So the number of places to protect with multi-factor is increasing as the minimum from the providers. And just to cover this slide, in addition to MFA helping you with identity attacks, if you can believe it or not, with everything we've learned from COVID, remote desktop is still heavily vulnerable and being abused. Organizations, big and small, are whether intentionally or unintentionally, they're exposing remote desktop to the public internet. And 50% of ransomware attacks are because of that remote desktop exposure. So it's really key that MFA is not just on your Microsoft account. It needs to be applied to any remote desktop services, VPN, and it's coming for server logins and networking equipment too.
Thanks, John. So the next area that we're seeing a lot of heightened scrutiny from the insurance providers and the applications is the endpoint detection response. And for some people, this might be new terminology. And really, endpoint detection response is modern day antivirus. It's next generation antivirus. For years, antivirus has been signature based, and it's been able only to detect when we know there is a threat. So, obviously, we've all been through a very recent event of experiencing what variants do when there's, a threat out in the wild with COVID-19. Before we had a test for COVID-19, we put rules into our companies, into our organizations, and, rules were put in place that based on people's symptoms, because they might be sick, we don't want to let them in. We want to make sure that they don't come in unless we know for sure they're safe. Well, in the antivirus world, we've only operated by the mechanism of having a positive or negative test for the majority of time. And we haven't been able to deal with people who haven't tested positive yet, but have symptoms and could be a carrier of the virus. And that's how endpoint detection response works. It uses anomaly-based protection. It doesn't just wait to make sure that we know the virus is on the computer. It waits and responds to the actions that it's taking and basically says, well, I don't like what this application is doing. I don't like what's going on here. And so I'm going to block it because it might be bad. And so that's a very big change from how we've said, I either know it's bad or I don't. And if I don't, I just let it do whatever it wants. Now we're going to say it might be. So we're going to be protecting against that. And zero-day threats are a serious concern we have in the industry. The attackers, the cyber criminals, know that the signature-based, the old school antivirus can't protect against their most recent code variants. And so we want to move to something that can handle the anomalies that even the most recent variants are presenting to our systems. And then the important thing is anyone reviewing those alerts from whatever antivirus solution you have in place? Having antivirus in place is great, but if no one can act on it, if something does get triggered, well, you're not going to stop it from spreading in your environment, and you're not going to be able to halt that attack or limit the risk and danger of that attack as early and as quickly as possible. So John, you want to elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
You bet. So really response is two parts, like Tyson mentioned, right? Having a tool that can look at behavior, what's normal, what's unexpected, what's irregular. using that tool to detect things like a bad actor moving from one machine or one place to the other. Detection based on behavior anomalies is critical, particularly because we want to prevent the bad guys from, compromising one device and moving on to many others, slowly moving their way up to, where the sensitive data is or those other kind of tier zero real critical servers. The other part to that, Tyson mentioned, is having eyes and hands on to a certain degree. We could implement, Microsoft's E5 licensing everywhere and put in the best tools, but if it's not being monitored, reviewed, acted upon, right, you're kind of halfway there. So it's really important that a IT team, or even better, a security operations center, has eyes and ears on your security tools. So a security operations center is more than just a technology. It's a team, it's an organizational unit, internal or external, that monitors and reviews those alerts, right? Adds the people and process aspects to that detection and protection. So whether your endpoint detection response tool does it automatically, with aggressive defaults, or whether your security center acts on it, having an endpoint detection tool that has advanced features and being able to, for example, with the click of a button, isolate a bad machine is really crucial. So it's a two-part product and people to manage and monitor the solution.
Excellent, thank you. Still very important is hardware and software patching. All application code has vulnerabilities, whether it be operating systems, whether it be Chrome or Acrobat or some other application using. Writing an application is like building a wall. You put a bunch of bricks in place, you put mortar in between to hold them together, and you've built a wall, or you've built an application. Just like when you build a wall, there are small cracks that happen in that building process that if you look from a distance, you won't see. But if you get in there with a magnifying glass really close, you'll see these cracks and you'll see these vulnerabilities. And all software has these vulnerabilities. And as the bad actors try to get into environments, they go probing for these vulnerabilities in your software and try to use that as a way to gain entry into your system. So patching is the best way we can prevent those vulnerabilities being exposed. Just like when you have a crack in a wall, you patch it to get rid of that crack, to make sure nothing can get in, to make sure the heat doesn't get out, and to keep the water out. We patch software in the same manner to make sure that it maintains strength and resiliency against the attacks that are going to be happening.
And key here is vulnerability management. So not just assessment, right? So running vulnerability assessments or scans for these known issues is the first step, and that's great. But if you have a report of a bunch of vulnerabilities and don't act on them, that doesn't solve the problem. So it's really about managing vulnerabilities from detection to actually remediating them. You're never going to remediate 100% of the vulnerabilities, right? But you run a vulnerability scan on a regular basis, and then you start to remediate and tackle those items that are critical or high to start with, and you work your way through it. It really depends on exposure. So prioritization is really key, and having a tool in person to help you prioritize and remediate properly. Patching is of course very important, and there's many things we could patch automatically, but we always have to keep in mind that not everything can be automatically patched. There's solutions and technology to patch almost everything, but do you really want to automatically patch, the SQL server that's used for your critical or ERP system, right? Some services and tools still need manual patching. That could be a SQL database, that could be an Apache web server. So it's really important that you do, of course, first patching, run your regular vulnerability scans, and then come up with a plan to remediate what's not being automatically patched, and in what order based on criticality, exposure to the internet, and those other factors.
And we have seen some questionnaires now wanting proof that you're doing patching on a regular basis and the status and results of your patching. So if you're just using the Windows automated patching out of the box, you can't get that information. You need a managed patching service that checks the patches, makes sure they're safe before they go onto your systems, and then ensures that the patches are happening on a regular basis and allows you to report on the status of those operating system patches to make sure you're keeping up to date. Backing up your data. It's critically important that you back up your data. It doesn't matter whether it's the data that is on your on-premise servers or workstations, or it's the data that you have in the cloud, because there's a misconception out there that the majority of cloud providers back up your data. They back up their system to make sure that it's operating properly in event of a failure. But most cloud systems don't back up your data. So if you're using Microsoft's online email system and you aren't buying any third-party email backup services, your email data that's in Office 365 or Google's G Suite or any other hosted email solution may likely isn't being backed up. And therefore, if someone deletes something, you need to get it back, you don't have that information available. And of course, you want to back up your on-premise data, both for protection from hardware failure and our typical concerns prior to the last few years of cybercrime and ransomware was fire, flood, those types of risks. Now you're much more likely to lose data due to a cybersecurity event than a fire or a flood. And because it's specifically targeting your computer systems, your users may physically be in your building perfectly able to work, but they have no computers to work on. So it's pretty much the worst case scenario, because everybody can come to work, but they can't do anything. So having good quality backups with a system that you can recover from very quickly if you do have a cybersecurity event is absolutely critical. And that's why it's an important one on many of the questionnaires that we see. One of the things we'll also see is asking for a description of your online and offline backups. And we're seeing even more now wanting to know how often you've done a data recovery test or any sort of proof that your backup system is in place.
Yeah, Tyson mentioned it, those two keys, right? So having a reliable quality backup system and remembering that kind of traditional long-standing 3-2-1 rule. So we want, at least 3 copies, such as a monthly, weekly, daily, 2 different locations. So if the on-premise, for example, backup is ransomed, you can go to a cloud backup to get your data back, and one of those copies being off-site. So that 3-2-1 rule is still very applicable, as Tyson mentioned, more from a cybercrime issue than a fire or flood. And then the second part of that is testing your backups. A lot of organizations do not have formal testing. They'll informally or ad hoc, restore a file here and there. But it's really important that you test on a regular basis. Can I restore a file? Can I restore an email or a SharePoint site? Can I restore a whole virtual machine or a virtual server? So it's really important to test those key type of restores on at least a quarterly basis.
For sure. We do have a question about the endpoint detection response, or an EDR tool, and what is the minimum an insurer expects. So it is going to be very dependent on the insurer, but just having an EDR tool in place versus traditional signature-based antivirus is usually going to be a very solid check mark that's going to not be a hindrance to getting insurance or be greatly increasing the cost. It may actually help be something that reduces the cost of your overall cyber insurance. One question that we often are now seeing, even with EDR, is they're asking, do you have an enhanced endpoint or a modern endpoint detection and response solution, but also is it managed, or is someone seeing the alerts? So usually a product like Microsoft Defender, not the Windows Defender that comes just with the operating system, but Microsoft 365 Defender for endpoint is enough of an EDR tool for sure, but someone needs to be monitoring and managing those alerts, because that EDR tool, as John mentioned earlier, loses a lot of its value if no one's doing anything with the alerts that it's generating.
Defender, that's now included in Business Premium, does include EDR and tamper protection features. So that is definitely a sufficient tool for sure, even in the lower plans.
Information security and governance. So we're seeing more questions now, not only about what tools do you have in place, but now we're starting to get into the policies and what procedures and what are you doing as an organization to ensure that you're taking the steps to make sure your staff understand and your organization understands how data should be classified, how data should be used, who should have access to what data. Do you even know who has access to all of your data or your different shares on your different servers? Do you realize how exposed you are? And as you start putting data into cloud services, do you understand the governance that goes with that data being stored in those locations? How many employees do you have dedicated to security? How many people are even aware of the security requirements or compliancy needs that you may have in your organization, or you may have because of the customers that you do business with? And how long have you been in a security position in an organization? How long has an organization had someone in a security position? And how well does the organization understand its security posture? Do you comply with any standards? Do you need to comply with any standards? And how do you properly understand this?
So a few key pieces here. So the virtual information security officer really is a resource or partner that helps you bring those security policies, practices, and technology together to really, whether it's the Center for Internet Security, NIST, you name the framework, to really implement those security improvements well. You have to bring the products, people, and process together. So that security officer helps move those items along. Uh, Another option is, of course, managed security services. So, in many cases, that involves taking a well known security framework like CIS and bringing those improvements into an organization. So, starting with an assessment, prioritizing what needs to be done, and implementing the security products, processes, and changes to increase scoring and increase the security maturity. Um, Policy is really key. Whether you're scoring against a security framework, whether you're helping empower people in your organization to pay attention to security and improve security, policy management is key. Users really need to understand, what is the right things to do, what are things we should not be doing. If we have questions, who do we go to? What's the procedure for raising incidents or bringing concerns forward? It really ties in that people process technology. Generally speaking, and I'll use CIS as an example, if you're not looking to improve things on an ongoing basis, continuous improvement, and you're not bringing policies to back your security improvements, you'll never score more than a 2 out of 5. So having policies, procedures, continuous improvement, ongoing, assessment, improvements, and reassessing helps you get those higher scores.
Thanks. Item next 6 is security assessments and training. It is critical that your staff understand what their responsibility is from a security perspective. If you haven't trained them on it, you can't set expectations for what they should be doing or shouldn't be doing from a cybersecurity risk perspective. And it's very important for organizations to understand that the responsibility of cybersecurity is not on IT. The responsibility for cybersecurity is on senior executives, because at the end of the day, if everything goes down, it's the senior executives that are going to be held responsible for keeping the organization alive and afloat. So IT is a component of making it happen. They help procure the right services, they help implement them, they help make sure it's being done, they meet the needs of the organization sets, but the senior executive team needs to be heavily involved and understand what the security requirements for the organization are. And do you report on your security? Have you done an assessment? Do you understand what level of risk you're at as an organization? And then the training that goes with that to make sure that your staff understand the risk that they have based on either the applications they use, the tools they use, and how they use it. Organizations are not attacked. Users are attacked. 90% of the times we see they go after a user, and that's the weakest link to get into an organization. And the first thing you can do is train your users properly.
Yeah, and that training is critical. So not just at hire, it needs to be regularly scheduled programming. At a minimum, you want to train at hire and then once a year. In a perfect world, you might provide a topic every quarter. particularly from a social engineering perspective. We really need users to help us identify social engineering attempts, whether it's, a fishy email, a link in a text message. There's so many ways to get to people, right? Email, yes, is continually, spam and phishing attempts are never going to go away. But now I could reach out to somebody in Teams and chat in Teams and send a fishy link, text message to people's phones. There's so many avenues to, trick people. So that training and regular training is key. Um, just an example of that responsibility for executive. There was an organization in Winnipeg that was still running Windows 7 for many years. Every budget year, we need budget to move to Windows 10. It was denied. Sure enough, the organization was ransomed because of Windows 7 not getting patches. So it wasn't IT's fault, right? They're proposing improvements, proposing a budget, and ultimately that fell with management who didn't improve that budget to get to a current operating system. In addition to user security, there's certain tests and scans that need to be done on a regular basis. We talked about regularly scanning your environment for vulnerabilities. So we want to scan internal systems and external facing systems for vulnerabilities. That's going to tell us, what are the gaps, what can be exploited. And then we also want to perform penetration tests to see if we can actually exploit those known vulnerabilities. Whether it's a vulnerability test or a penetration test, those results need to be actioned. So you need a remediation strategy for those type of scans. And depending on your findings, you want to act on those in a reasonable manner. If you have a public facing service or server that has been vulnerability scanned and has, multiple critical vulnerabilities, you need to be on that in days or weeks. Because if you're not, the bad guys are probably already poking around and looking at it. Part of the user training is sending out regular end user phishing tests. We could test people with, phishing examples in a, polite and politically correct way. We're not saying trick your employees into clicking a link to get their bonus. There is ethical ways to test people's skill at detecting phishing attempts. And then the last item is those regular assessments. So you want to take a globally accepted framework like a CIS or a NIST and assess your environment. It's really a three-step process. You want to do the initial assessment, understand your strengths, weaknesses, those gaps to address, implement a prioritized remediation plan, form actual remediation, and then validate, report on your improvements, validate that your new controls are working. And that has to happen in a cyclical approach. Ideally, you'd be reassessing, making improvements every year as part of the budgeting and roadmap exercises.
The seventh item that we're seeing coming up more commonly on the insurance forms is, do you have security information and event management? And what that means is, do you have a service that is taking all of the logs from all of your systems and reviewing those logs for security events? The reason that we want this is most bad actors are in your environment for an extended period of time, months, before they actually trigger any ransom or any other attacks. They spend their time lurking around, wanting to understand what data is most important, where they can do the most damage, where they can cause you the most pain to get the most money from you. And without a SIM system in place, you don't have the ability to see those bad actors operating inside of your environment or see a risk or a threat moving laterally throughout your environment. And it's not going to prevent it from happening, but it's going to help see and understand what happened. And then if there is an attack and an event, it is information that's very valuable to the recovery and the remediation from that event. So it really comes down to, what are you doing today to monitor your logs and to prevent attacks to your system?
Yeah. And like the endpoint detection and response, it's really going to be two parts. So collecting those logs and then acting on those logs. When it comes to logging, right, you need to start with an overall logging process that determines, what logs are important to us. Where are those logs? So we want to collect those logs, store them in a central location, and then review those logs. And we're not talking about a person, reviewing every log entry in line in a log file. It's using tools and technology that looks for, irregular behavior, looks for anomalies, brings it all together and correlates those logs so you have actionable information to detect things quicker and, of course, respond quicker. So it's really collecting those logs and then, enabling you to respond in a more informed, quicker fashion. We want to reduce the time the bad guys are in. We want to, reduce the time it takes to recover, and in some cases, be able to respond, very quickly. Um, Bringing these together, for example, sending the logs from your endpoint detection and response tool to the same security information and management platform allows you to, have one source of truth and be backed by that same security operations center. So just like the endpoint detection and response, security operations center can do the heavy lifting for you. They could review those logs, detect anomalies, alert you, call you when there's critical items found. Bringing those together really reduces critical time.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. So those are the 7 areas that we've been seeing most consistently on most application forms. But in the last while, we've seen some additional questions come up depending on the industry, the size, or just the carrier and what they ask. So we've seen some questions about how much do you spend on IT security? And I don't know that anyone's been denied because they don't spend enough, but it's something that they're wanting to understand as an individual line item. And I don't know that most organizations have broken out that cost or understood that cost of what they're spending on their IT spend today. Do you anticipate spending more, the same, or less? This is where it starts to become a more of a grading of what you're doing with your cybersecurity footprint, your posture. Are you making a commitment to cybersecurity protection in your organization? And if you're not, that could affect your coverage or your cost. How many employees do you have in a dedicated role in IT security? Or are you using a third-party provider to help with your IT security? And at the end of the day, what it really means is you need to budget for security. There's no if, there's no maybe, there's no when. Cybersecurity needs to be something that everyone's putting into their budget, irrelevant from everything else that's in your IT budget. You've got an IT budget already for upgrades and plan changes and new business processes that you want to put in place that you need IT to support. Separate from all of that, you need to be budgeting for cybersecurity across all of those different IT initiatives and IT resources that you already have in place. Some other questions we've seen is what are your third-party providers and what is their security? And do you know what their security posture is? When you're going out to cloud service providers, when you're going out to third-party providers, they should be able to tell you what their security posture is, whether they've worked against a framework, what they're doing to improve and ensure that their cybersecurity house is in order. That's critical to you because they're providing the services to you that help create and protect your environment and create a safe workspace for your users from a security perspective.
So some of the same questions we ask ourselves, right? We want to ask those providers. So, does that third party have their own cybersecurity insurance? Are they following security frameworks? What security credentials do they have? Are they keeping them current and renewing them? Are they testing their own employees? Do they have MFA on their own systems? Any system that has your data or your credentials, are those backed by MFA? And that they have policies that align to the framework that they've chosen above. So we can apply a lot of the best practices and questions to those third parties too.
Absolutely. So the top actions that need to be taken: establish your security policies, get oversight of your security program, whatever security program you have in place or you think you have in place. Have someone external take a look at it and make sure it's valid and viable and enough for your organization. Have an external scan done by a professional before you apply. We see a lot of the insurance companies performing external scans, and sadly, they're not being done by highly capable people. And so we're seeing people just being outright denied because of a scan that's done right at the beginning of the application process. And the scan turned up something that is completely unimportant. It's kind of like you go to apply for insurance, you say your medical's all fine, but you haven't been for a blood test or to your doctor in 20 years, and you answer, I'm fine for everything, and they do the blood test and it shows a concern. They're denying you outright because of this concern, because they basically think you lied. But in all honesty, you didn't know you had that risk or that concern. This is a way to find that out ahead of time. Remove excessive administrative rights. That's a critical one, especially to cloud services. Set up multi-factor authentication for everything. You should be using MFA anywhere and everywhere possible for all services that you have. And no, users aren't going to like it. No, people aren't going to enjoy it. But at this point, it's a requirement. You just have to have it because it's the only way we can guarantee that your users are who they say they are when they go to authenticate to a service. Train your users. Make sure they understand cybersecurity, understand the risks. This is a new area. We just added this slide for this specific presentation because these are some new trends that we're starting to see. So data classification and loss prevention. People are specifically being asked now on their cybersecurity applications, do you label your documents both digitally on-premise and in the cloud, and make sure you have some sort of a data classification system? Are you preventing external chat and email and the sharing of sensitive information? Are you auditing that? Do you have any way of knowing if people are sharing sensitive information? It's often called data loss prevention or DLP technology. Do you have DLP in place? And if you don't today, there are a number of ways that that can be done. Multi-factor authentication. Now we're seeing it not just, and John mentioned this earlier already, not just seeing it for cloud-based services, whereas what we saw last year, mostly the questions asking, now we're seeing more questions, do you have it for your firewalls and your switches and the other systems that might make you more vulnerable? Do you actually require it for everyone logging onto their computer to log onto their computer with MFA and or logging onto your servers with MFA? They want people proving who they are, because if you prove who you are with MFA, the risk of an exposure is less. And what cybersecurity frameworks are guiding you. Have you had an assessment? Are you using a framework? Or are you just doing cybersecurity based on what somebody told you? Even in a podcast like this or a presentation like this, yeah, we're giving you good information, but we're giving you a small snippet of all the things that you should be looking at for cybersecurity as a whole. And while the top 7 items are important, and they're the ones you're most likely going to get questioned on, a lot of the questionnaires now want to know how well have you reviewed and scoped your cybersecurity posture. And so they want to know what you're using. We've aligned to CIS, the Center for Internet Security. We've aligned to that because it's vendor, country, and really purpose agnostic. It is a dedicated organization that is a nonprofit specifically for the purpose of improving cybersecurity. That's the sole reason they exist. And sometimes best practices are the most important thing to put in place. You may choose best practices from different frameworks, but aligning to a framework is generally going to be the best way to start and the best way to improve your cybersecurity right from the very beginning. So you will each be sent our answers to the 7 security questions to ask your IT provider that we just talked about earlier, to make sure that you've got that protection for you.